Genetically modified foods are everywhere in the food supply. They are all over the supermarket, and most people don't even know what they are. When I start talking about GMOs, people ask me, how can something like this happen? Today we're going to help separate some of the facts from the fiction when it comes to genetically modified food. Thanks for watching today. I'm Laura Cataract, Master of Science in Human Nutrition. I tell everybody all the time, do not expect to go on the World Wide Web and do research that is going to give you accurate answers to your food and nutrition questions. Why? Because it is loaded with false information. Today we're going to talk about genetically modified foods. And when I do this, I'm going to use clips from another YouTube video that I recently watched from a gentleman that seems very articulate, very intelligent, and seems to know his stuff. He is clearly pro-GMO, and he's done this video really bashing and sarcastically making fun of what he calls anti-GMO propaganda. If anybody watched this video from beginning to end, I'm sure they would come away with the feeling that GMO foods are perfectly fine and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. However, when I take a closer look at his information, I'm going to point out to you some serious flaws in his presentation.
You know, I love looking at anti-GMO propaganda. It's kind of like looking at memes, but a lot worse. So if you enjoy that kind of masochism, go ahead and sit back, relax, get yourself a genetically modified snack. I have a Fuji apple, and enjoy.
So he begins by saying he has his GMO snack and a Fuji apple. Well, right off the bat, somebody like myself knows he clearly doesn't even understand what genetically modified foods are, because I will bet my own soul that that Fuji apple is not genetically modified. How do you know? It's easy. Look at the PLU number. The PLU number, those are the little stickers that you have on your fruits and vegetables. The number at the top. If it begins with a 9, that means it is organically grown. If it begins with a 3 or a 4, that means it is conventionally grown. If it begins with an 8, then it's genetically modified. However, genetically modified foods are never found in the produce section, yet most people seem to get the impression that they are. Somewhere along the line, we seem to think that genetically modified foods were fruits and vegetables in whole form, somewhere in the produce section, that were grown from genetically modified seeds. But that is not the problem. Vegetables conventionally grown are usually manufactured under a process called hybridization or crossbreeding. Now, there's lots of articles out there and information online that will try to convince you that hybridization is the same thing as genetic modification. It is not. In hybridization, they do not remove any part of the genetic code or put a foreign genetic code into the fruit or vegetable. Hybridization uses the same genetic codes, the same DNA, in other words, that are already in the fruit, and mixes it up into different sequences. This might make bigger fruit, more flavorful fruit, or whatnot. And of course, crossbreeding is just taking like a red apple and combining it with a green apple and then coming up with a different type of apple. Really nothing unusual in nature. I mean, yes, is it toying with nature? It is, but not to the extent that genetic modification does, which I'll explain in a minute. But for now, let's get back to our friend.
Hey look, my genetically modified fruit bit me back. Frankenfoods are fun foods. I don't think that this one's trying to make any specific argument unless whoever made it actually thinks that genetically modified fruit can spontaneously grow human teeth. But no, it's probably just hyperbole, right?
Okay, so he's clearly making fun of an ad aimed at bashing Monsanto. Monsanto is a big, giant corporation that has many, many patents on genetically modified seeds. So again, do I agree with this type of advertising against GMOs? I don't know. I'm kind of on the border, but clearly whoever designed that advertisement is being excessive and they're being humorous and going over the line. But it's really just to drive home to the public, to the average consumer, that, you know, these things that we've been told are safe, might not be a good idea. And the reason a lot of people feel this way is because with genetic modification, unlike hybridization, you actually design a genetic sequence and put it into the food that the food would not normally take on itself. So when you do that, when you put a genetic code into a food, you can get the food to express a trait. In fact, let's just see how my friend here explains it, and then I'll explain it my way.
If you take the genetic code for a specific trait within an animal and move it into another animal, the trait there is the only thing that's going to change. So even if you did take a little bit of genetic code from a trout and put it into a tomato, the tomato would not suddenly become some kind of tomato-trout chimera. Alright, I just had to say that just in case someone out there doesn't actually know how it works.
Okay, I totally agree with him here. If you take a piece of genetic material from one plant and put it in another plant, the second plant does not become the first plant. The whole idea behind genetic modification is what he says. It's to get the plant to express a specific trait. However, with genetically modified corn and genetically modified soy, two of the biggest genetically modified crops grown in the United States, the traits that they've been designed to express are very unusual. For example, Monsanto's genetically modified corn has been designed to act as a pesticide. Yes, the actual plant itself becomes a pesticide. So in other words, the farmers who grow this corn, it's very advantageous to them, at least it would seem, because they don't have to worry about pests, particularly the worms that tend to invade crops. So their crops will not be destroyed by pests. However, one of the issues that they face is the fact that these are not resistant to weeds. So they still have to throw gallons of herbicide on these crops. And more importantly, they have to throw gallons and gallons of fertilizer on these crops. Chemical fertilizers loaded with nitrogen that later runs off into the rivers and ends up down into the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico becomes larger and larger every spring because of this runoff. Now, the dead zone has always been there. And what it is, it's an area full of algae so thick that when fish swim into it, they'll die and suffocate if they don't swim out fast enough. So many of the fish are suffocating and dying here every year. And like I said, these dead zones have always been present at certain times of year. But with the industrial farming and the growth of genetically modified crop growing, these dead zones are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they are considered quite a serious environmental problem. Not to mention that the soy that was designed by Monsanto was designed to express the trait of an herbicide. So the actual plant is an herbicide. Yes. When you grow the soy plants, in other words, one of the biggest problems the farmers had was the fact that soy would get, strangled by weeds. So they designed a seed where you could grow soy and not have to worry about these weeds. But again, you still have to cover these plants with pesticides to keep pests off and tons of fertilizers. This is monocultural farming. And the concept of farming just one crop. So it completely destroys soil, another big problem, and it is literally impossible to grow any of these crops without massive amounts of fertilizer. Again, the farmer is looking for the highest yield possible because basically the higher the yield, the more money they make in subsidies from the government.
If this guy wouldn't even breathe it, then why would you eat it? I would eat it because the poison is in the dose.
This is a very good point, actually. He says the poison is in the dose. So what does he mean by that? Basically what he's telling us is this, that yeah, they're showing a picture of a farmer spraying pesticides all over crops. Naturally, he's being exposed to lots of pesticides, so he's wearing a mask to hope to protect himself. Now, of course, the amount of pesticide in his Fuji apple is not going to equal the amount of pesticides that that farmer is exposed to. That's a given. However, let's go on and listen to the rest of his spiel about this and see what he says about the dose dependency.
I'm sure that farmers that spray pesticides manually on their crops would probably breathe in way too much pesticide to be actually deemed safe if they weren't wearing a mask. But just because a farmer needs to wear a mask in order to be safe while spraying pesticides on his crops for hours on end does not mean that the crops themselves are getting an unsafe amount of pesticides on them. And if you could test whether or not the amount of pesticides that do get on the crops was safe for human consumption, then everything would be just fine. If only tests like that had been conducted thousands and thousands of times.
Okay, I really like this part of his presentation because it clearly displays some of the ignorance in the general public. Honestly, I really do think that this gentleman is very intelligent. I actually enjoy some of his other videos, but he is wrong about this. There have not been thousands and thousands of tests done on the level of pesticides safe for human consumption. Now, in fact, there's never thousands of tests done on anything that's released into the food supply, and I'll explain that a little bit later in this video. For example, there's a study here on my computer. If you just let me look this way for a second. It says pesticides are widely used in agriculture and other settings, resulting in continuing human exposure. Epidemiological studies indicate that despite pre-market animal testing, current exposures are associated with risks to human health. Pre-market animal testing. There's one thing you have to understand about science. Tests done on animals cannot be translated to human. Okay? Animals and humans are different. So yes, we do always start with animal testing, but to actually say, okay, we gave this amount of pesticide to a rat or a guinea pig or whatever animal, mice, whatever it might be, and then to say, because this animal didn't die or didn't get sick, a human won't get sick. First of all, to actually accurately test the safety level of pesticides over a long-term exposure, you would have to have a controlled study where you had a group of humans eating fruits and vegetables grown in pesticides, comparing it to a group that did not. This is almost nearly impossible to conduct, and no one's going to spend the money, quite frankly, to do such an experiment. That's the whole problem with testing for a lot of things and their safety. The food industry is not going to put the money and time into such studies. So basically, this gentleman is under the impression that thousands of tests have been done. Now, again, in all fairness, the level of pesticides in his apple is unlikely to cause any kind of health issue for his entire life. But we don't just eat one apple with pesticides. We eat one apple, and then we eat bananas, and then we eat all our fruits and vegetables, and then we eat processed foods that are made with ingredients from genetically modified corn, which has been doused in herbicides as well as chemical fertilizers. So there's all kinds of toxins in the food supply, and that level of exposure increases every single time you eat processed foods or foods that are not grown organically. This is the issue, and this is the level of exposure that has never been tested. This is why there's scientific studies out there now trying to test for these things. Studies like this are nearly impossible to design, and the food industry certainly is not going to spend the time, the money, or any resources on trying to prove anything like that. They have very lenient guidelines that they have to abide by before they can release things into the food supply. Things are released into the food supply all the time without any stringent testing. This, of all things, is something everybody in the United States should realize, and realize it fast.
We engineered it so that it's resistant to the most annoying pests. You know, if this was the only thing you were exposed to, you might actually think that the only researchers to ever have tested genetically modified organisms were those hired by the manufacturers of GMOs themselves. That's totally false, though, and if you don't want to take my word for it, go ahead and check my sources in the description.
Well, the reason I didn't take his word for it is because I already know that that's not true. There has not been thousands of tests done on GMOs before they got released into the food supply, and I did check his resources. Ironically, if they've been deemed safe by so many thousands or hundreds of studies before they were released, then why are all his sources dated after 1996, when genetically modified foods were first introduced into the food supply. You see, there's lots of studies going on now trying to figure out what the health implications are of genetically modified crops. Why would anybody be wanting to study that if we already know that they're safe? Well, the truth is that we don't know that they're safe. And again, to conduct an experiment that is actually a clinically controlled trial is almost impossible. But let's see what else he has to say about this topic.
Monsanto does not have my consent to use my body as a science experiment. You know, Monsanto does not have your consent to use your body as a science experiment, and that's why they don't. See, before GMOs can even be put on the market, they have to be generally recognized as safe, and that takes a lot of testing. That means people in the past have given their consent to undergo trials to see whether or not GMOs are actually safe. And the overwhelming scientific consensus is that people who participate in those trials are no worse for wear after consuming GMOs.
Okay, so again, another ad against Monsanto, because Monsanto is the big player in the genetically modified crop business. So basically, this is people saying they didn't want their bodies being used as a science experiment. And our friend here claims that's not what they're doing, because these all had to be generally recognized as safe. If you don't know, generally recognized as safe is a list put out by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. It's also known as the GRAS list for short. Now, this is another huge misconception in the American public's mind. The idea is in our minds is that the FDA is somehow responsible for the safety of the food supply. They are not. Neither do they test or verify anything that goes on the GRAS list. This is an absolute truth. In fact, I'll leave a link to an article that explains it best and simplifies it for you in the comments below, so you can read it yourself. Now, this link comes from www.greenamerica.org. So you might be thinking, oh, they're biased, they're going to just tell us what they want. No, they are telling you the truth about what the FDA requires to get on the generally recognized as safe list. Actually, all it requires is testing from scientists hired by the manufacturer, in-house scientists from the manufacturer. In fact, you don't even have to do that, because the whole program is voluntary, which basically means food manufacturers can put any ingredients they want in our food, and they don't even have to have them put on the generally recognized as safe list. This is the absolute truth, and you can also read it on the FDA's own website, and I'll give you a link to that. But I will warn you that reading the FDA website is like reading legalese, so it can be difficult to follow sometimes. But another person who brought this to the public's attention was Melanie Warner in her book, Pandora's Lunchbox. I'll tell you, if you want to know everything and anything about processed foods, what they are, what's actually in them, how they're designed, and listen and read about interviews done with some of the actual food scientists, this is a fabulous book, Pandora's Lunchbox. In fact, I'll put a link to this book on so you can purchase it on Amazon if you like in the comments also. This is a great book. But yes, the GRAS list is not only the ingredients and products on there not tested by the FDA, but ingredients in foods don't even have to be on the GRAS list to go into a product. So while this might seem shocking to some people, and it should, it's absolute truth. It's been that way for years. You can read about the history of it a little bit in this book, along with many, many other things about processed foods that you would be most likely highly interested in if you're concerned about the safety of the food supply. But for now, I think that's enough about genetically modified foods. I'm going to do a follow-up video just so that this one does not go too long. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about these crops, some of the issues with them, and how your tax dollars pay for them. But until next time, love yourself enough to eat whole foods. Eat real, non-genetically modified foods.